Victor dropped to his knees right in front of me. In the bright ballroom, where people who were always sure of their status held their glasses and traded smiles sharp as blades, my husband collapsed as if all the strength had been pulled from his legs. This was the man who, for years, always held his head high, always walked into a room as if everything belonged to him. Yet now, when an old man stepped through the door, Victor fell straight from his pedestal onto the cold tile floor. I stood beside him, silent. I didn't help him up. I didn't panic. I just watched and realized this moment had arrived sooner than I expected. The old man looked at me first. His gaze was gentle, steady, without a hint of judgment. He smiled, so lightly that only someone waiting for the truth would notice. "We meet again," he said. His voice was calm but strong enough to make everyone around us stop. Victor looked up, his face pale as paper. He looked at the old man like he was staring at a ghost from a past he tried to bury. As for me, I knew this moment was the turning point my life had quietly been leading toward. But to understand why Victor knelt, why a simple old man could make him crumble like that, I need to go back to a very different morning. A morning I once thought had passed without leaving any trace. To understand this, I have to return to a morning on the bus. Back then, I was on my way to the office for a quarterly data meeting. My job was to analyze customer behavior data, something that required quiet, focus, and the ability to notice what others overlooked. I wasn't flashy or loud. I lived quietly, observing more than I spoke. And I used to think that was enough for a peaceful marriage. Victor was the opposite. He was the sales team leader at a tech corporation. He liked attention, liked being on stage, liked the feeling of everyone listening to him. Success made him naturally arrogant, as if it were his birthright. And to him, people with small jobs or roles that didn't generate revenue were just the background he walked on. That morning, the bus was packed. I stood near the door holding my laptop. Victor stood beside me, checking his watch over and over because he was afraid of being late for a meeting he said would decide the entire quarter. The bus jolted when the driver braked suddenly, and an old man near the exit lost his balance. No one reached out. No one moved. They just stepped aside like he was an obstacle. I managed to grab his arm before he fell. He let out a shaky breath. I kept him steady and asked if he was all right. He nodded, but he looked flustered as he tried to find his wallet to pay the fare. His slow movements irritated a few people behind him. They muttered like he was blocking their way on purpose. I tapped my card for him. "I'll take care of it," I said, in a normal voice, like it was nothing. But to him, maybe it meant more than I realized. Victor watched and sighed. He leaned toward me and said something quiet enough so no one else could hear, but clear enough for me to know exactly what he thought. "You make things harder for yourself." Not a thank you. Not concern. Just judgment. I stayed quiet like I always did. I didn't want to turn a simple kindness into an argument. The old man turned to me, his eyes warm and a little grateful. "My name is Albert," he said. "Thank you." I just nodded, a simple nod, and I thought that was the end of it. One small moment in the thousands that make up an ordinary life. I didn't know he would return to my world, and I had no idea he would be the one to make Victor's entire world collapse in an instant. After that morning on the bus, I thought everything would fall back into place. A small act in a crowded space, a thank you, two people crossing paths, then parting. That's what I told myself. But life didn't return to where it was. I was the only one who didn't notice it had already shifted. Victor started to change, in a way that was hard to name. Not suddenly. Not from affection to contempt. More like tiny needles, quiet and steady. A little more each day. Enough for me to feel the edge scraping against me, but not enough to make me cry out. "Must be tiring to sit at a computer all day, huh?" He said that one night after I just finished an analysis that helped my company predict next quarter's buying behavior. He didn't ask because he cared. He asked to remind me that my work meant nothing compared to the meetings, contracts, and revenue he bragged about every evening. I looked at him and said nothing. I'd learned that any comeback would never beat Victor's inflated ego, but he didn't stop there. At a meetup with his wealthier friends, the kind who talked about profits more to show off than to share anything real, Victor smiled and introduced me. Dana works in data, meaning she stares at numbers all day. The whole table laughed, not in a cruel way, but in a cheap one. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to explain myself to people who had no intention of understanding. But the look Victor gave me as he sat back down told me he was pleased with his little joke. Another small cut. Sharp. I took it, stayed quiet. A few weeks later, my company had an internal meeting. I presented a solution to reduce operating costs using a predictive model for shopping behavior. When I came home, I was still carrying a quiet sense of accomplishment, but Victor crushed it with one sentence. There are tons of ideas like that online. You probably just found something and tweaked it. I looked at him, longer than usual, not because I was hurt, but because I was finally seeing something clearly. Victor didn't belittle me because he didn't understand my work. He belittled me because it made him feel taller. Second cut, still sharp. Dinner with his family made everything even clearer. When his mother asked me about my new data project, I barely opened my mouth before Victor cut in, speaking faster than me. It's just a small project, Mom. Nothing big to talk about. He said it without even looking at me, like he was snuffing out a flame before it had a chance to flicker. I stayed quiet. I watched how he loved controlling the story, how he loved being the only one others paid attention to, and I started to see his nature clearly. Victor valued social power more than real people. He cared more about being admired by outsiders than respecting the person right next to him. Inside me, nothing felt soft or sad, just a cold stream running through. I wasn't angry. I was simply awake. From then on, I began watching him more closely. Not to judge, to understand. And the more I watched, the more I saw he didn't realize he was pushing me away bit by bit. One late night, he came home in a rare state of excitement. He tossed his keys on the table, turned to me and said with proud confidence, "There's a big meeting coming up. The company's major investor is coming to review the new project. If he's impressed, my career will jump to the next level." I nodded calmly. "What's his name?" "Raymond." He said the name like it was a god who could change his life. Then he added, "People say he's tough, but I know exactly what someone like that needs." I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to hear Victor categorize people based on how much power they had. But the name Raymond made me pause for a second. I'd heard it before, not from my work, not from any meetings. It came from a small story someone once mentioned on a bus. I couldn't recall the details, but the image of the old man from that day flashed through my mind so quickly that I had to wonder why my memory chose that moment to come back. I didn't think much of it. I had no reason to connect the two names. Raymond was wealthy and powerful. Albert was just an ordinary old man I met on a bus. How could those two possibly be connected? Even so, in that brief moment, I felt something uncertain. A thin thread, almost invisible, pulling tight between the two names. I didn't understand. I didn't try to understand, but the feeling stayed with me the whole night. A cold instinct ran down my spine, thin but clear, like life was slowly turning in a direction I hadn't caught up with yet, and I knew that if that thread really existed, it would pull its way to me in a way no one could predict. Victor's company held their partnership signing ceremony on a windy Friday morning. I went with him, not because he wanted me there, but because having a polished wife at his side made his image look complete. Victor didn't say it outright, but his "just come along so we look like a pair" was enough to make the role he gave me painfully clear. I didn't argue. I didn't see the need. Sometimes people reveal their true nature through the most ordinary lines. The conference hall was bright, wide, and filled with the mix of expensive perfume and the soft clink of glasses. Guests from the corporation walked in one by one. Victor stood next to me, but his mind was on the people he needed to impress. I just stood still, watching. Then the doors opened. Another group of guests walked in, and in the middle of them, slow and steady, was the old man I'd met on the bus, Albert. I didn't even have time to react before Victor froze in place, his hand going stiff like it had been locked. His eyes moved from the group of guests to Albert. I saw the exact moment he realized something he never could have imagined. Albert wasn't some random old man on a bus. Albert was the father of Raymond, the man Victor believed would lift him to a new level in his career. Silence dropped between us like a sheet of cold glass. Victor looked at Albert with a panic I had never seen in him. All the arrogance, every layer of confidence he wrapped around himself cracked in a single breath. Albert looked around and stopped at me. He smiled, the same small smile he had on the bus that day when I caught him and tapped the fare for him in the middle of that indifferent crowd. "You're the one who didn't hesitate to help me that day," he said, loud enough for the people around us to hear. The chatter faded, like someone slowly turned a volume dial down. Victor's boss, standing a few steps away, turned toward us. Curiosity shifted into observation, then into judgment. And Victor? His face went pale. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at me like I was the rope pulling him straight to the bottom. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence do its work. And it worked so well I could almost feel the vibration of Victor's shame moving through him. When he finally had no choice but to look at me, I spoke. My voice was steady, cold enough that no one could mistake it for an emotional outburst. "You always think the people worth respecting are the ones with power. But that day, you ignored the most important person." One sentence, nothing more. But Victor froze like someone had pulled all the air out of his lungs. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't see the man I knew. I saw a smaller version, scrambling inside himself, with nothing to hold on to. Albert eased the moment with a gentle smile. Then he began retelling what happened on the bus. He didn't drag it out. He didn't exaggerate. He simply stated the truth. He had stumbled. No one helped. I kept him steady and paid his fare. But the truth doesn't need drama. It only needs the right people listening. The crowd didn't say a word, but their eyes did. Victor, the man trying so hard to impress an investor, had once been given the simplest chance to show something basic, kindness, and he didn't take it. Victor's boss looked at him again, slowly, as if he were reading a complete report on his character. Victor tried to stand tall, but I watched his shoulders sink bit by bit. I realized that moment was the turning point. Not because I won, not because Victor lost, but because the truth had walked into the room and it wasn't on his side. Albert ended the story with, "I don't forget the person who helped me when no one else paid attention." No one added anything. But in that quiet, Victor stood completely exposed. He didn't need anyone to accuse him. His actions that day, his indifference, the way he belittled me, they all came back and lined up behind him, clear enough that he couldn't deny any of it. I looked at Victor without spite, without anger. I just looked at him the way you look at a final piece of truth settling into place, and I knew. From this moment on, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. After Albert finished telling the story, the ceremony was no longer Victor's stage. The lights, the eyes, the conversations around us, all of it seemed to pull away from him. I saw him try to steady his breath, as if standing up straight could somehow patch the piece of dignity that had just been torn open. But in a world where people observe each other with calculation, a tear like that can't be hidden. Victor looked at me first, not with his usual arrogance, not with the casual dismissiveness he threw at me every day. It was the look of someone who knew he was standing at the edge of a cliff. "You misunderstood," he said quickly, lowering his voice so no one else would hear. "That day, I just didn't notice. I didn't answer. I didn't need to ask him why. And I didn't need him to admit what the entire room had just seen. Any explanation now was nothing more than an attempt to save the ego he feared losing more than anything else." Victor kept going, almost desperate. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know how I am. I glanced at him once. Just once. My silence cut his words off in the air. I realized something. All these years, I'd been responding in ways that made him believe he had the right to define my worth. I stayed quiet for peace, to avoid conflict, to keep everything looking fine. But today, in a room full of strangers, I saw clearly what I had forgotten. I wasn't small the way he wanted me to believe. The shift inside me wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It came like a door opening, light but certain. I'd had enough. When the event ended, Victor grabbed my wrist right in front of a few of his co-workers. What looked like a gentle gesture was full of the urgency he was trying to hide. "Can you stay for a bit? Let me explain." I pulled my hand back, calm. "No need," I said. He glanced around, afraid someone might see this. For Victor, reputation was the last layer of clothing. He couldn't bear another tear in it. "Dana, don't do this in front of everyone. We'll talk later." His voice was low, but couldn't hide his unease. I stood facing him, neither stepping forward nor back. I saw him waiting for me to soften, waiting for me to lean toward him out of habit or history the way I always had. But today, I wasn't standing where I used to. "You've never really seen me," I said, my voice sharp and cold, even when I was right here. Just one sentence. No emphasis, no raised voice. But Victor jolted as if someone had yanked a brake straight through his chest. I saw the moment the truth hit him like a thin needle, small, but sharp enough to collapse everything he'd been holding on to. Not because I said something harsh, not because I accused him, but because he knew it was completely true. He had never seen me, not my effort, not my worth, not the person I really was, beyond the role he assigned to me. And now he had to face that truth in front of the very people he wanted to impress. I turned away. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize it. Just a normal step, but enough for Victor to understand that whatever power he thought he still had over me was gone. I heard him call my name behind me, soft but frantic. He didn't call out of love. He called out of fear. Fear of losing the peace he always assumed would stay in place for him to lean on whenever he needed. But I didn't look back. I walked out of the conference room, the room where the truth showed itself more clearly than any presentation or contract. And with that step, I realized Victor's shadow no longer stretched over my life. The revenge arc didn't start when I said something cold. The revenge arc started when I walked away, not waiting for his apology, not waiting for his understanding, not waiting for him to change. I walked away because I finally saw things clearly. Because I didn't need to stay somewhere my worth had been shrunk to fit the narrow view of a man too used to looking up and forgetting to look sideways. Behind me, Victor stood there, stripped of power not because anyone judged him, but because the truth exposed him at the exact moment he needed it hidden most. And for the first time in years, the air around me felt wide enough to breathe. After that event, everything didn't collapse on Victor all at once. The people who usually sided with him kept acting the same, but no one brought up the meeting with Albert anymore. That quiet avoidance was the first sign. Then on the third day, Victor was called into a meeting with his superiors. It didn't last long, 15 minutes. But when he stepped out, I could see the strain on his face no matter how hard he tried to hide it. The company questioned him about his unprofessional behavior in front of a key client. From what should have been a normal interaction, his reputation bent out of shape because of one small truth. He disrespected the exact person he needed most. In his world, even a tiny crack is enough for people to start doubting your leadership. And Victor knew that better than anyone. He didn't tell me. But news always finds its way to the person who wants to know. I watched from a distance, no longer feeling the urge to defend him, to explain for him, or to soften anything for him like I used to. My silence now wasn't patience. It was the clear line between two people who were no longer standing on the same side of anything. That afternoon, Victor came to find me, not with the attitude of someone who wanted to fix anything, but of someone afraid of losing the last piece of dignity he still had. He stood at the door, shoulders held straight, but his eyes were empty, like he was leaning on the wall to keep himself from collapsing. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded and sat down across from him. No avoiding, no softening, just steady breathing. Victor took a deep breath, as if convincing himself he could still control the situation. But the moment he tried to speak and blame it on circumstances, on misunderstandings, I heard a slight tremor in his voice. "Dana, you know I didn't mean it, right? Everything that happened that day was just, it's not about that day," I said, my voice flat as cold water. He stopped. For the first time, Victor had no words to push forward, no usual excuses, no confident mask to wear. I saw him lose a breath. Then something I never expected happened. Victor dropped to his knees, not the kind of kneeling meant to beg for love or hold together a marriage that's already cracked. It was the kneeling of someone who finally saw the real consequences of the things he'd dismissed for years. He lowered his head. His shoulders shook once, a movement he tried hard to control. "I was wrong," he said. "I'm scared of losing everything." I looked at him, not pleased, not satisfied, because this wasn't a victory. It was simply the natural result of the truth coming to light. Victor was collapsing under the weight of the very thing he chased. I wasn't the one who brought him down. The pedestal he'd stood on for so long just couldn't hold him anymore. I let a few seconds pass, no rush to speak. Then I stood, looking down at him from a distance just wide enough for him to understand that what I was about to say didn't come from anger or bitterness, only clarity. "I'm not walking away to hurt you," I said slowly, steady. "I'm walking away because I deserve better." Nothing more. No explanation. No turning back. Victor looked up, his eyes full of desperation, not because of love, but because he finally realized the only power he thought he had over me was gone. I didn't say another word. I didn't reach out. I didn't help him up. I turned and walked straight out of the house that used to belong to both of us. The door closed behind me with a small, soft sound, but it was more final than any argument we'd had over the years. Outside, the air felt different. No pressure, no weight. I took a long breath and felt what I had just reclaimed, myself. As I walked down the street, the image of the old man on the bus came back to me, not as a sad memory, but as a marker. One small act, something so ordinary, had turned my whole life in a direction I never expected. Not because it changed Victor, but because it changed how I saw myself. That truth, simple, quiet, was the lever that lifted me out of a place I had stayed in for far too long. And for the first time, the road ahead didn't look like loss. It looked like space, enough space for me to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the end, the moment that woke me up didn't come from watching Victor fall. It came from a simple truth. When you stand by small, quiet acts of kindness, life gives you its answers. Something that seems meaningless can become the line that shows you you've stayed too long in a place that's no longer yours. What about you? Has there been a moment that made you look at yourself and realize what you truly needed? Share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. Thank you for listening, And don't forget to support the channel with a subscribe and a like. Every bit of support means a lot.